The bell above the cafe door chimed softly, a sound most people barely noticed, but to her it meant nothing at all, and yet it still marked another moment in a world that often forgot she existed. As Emma stepped inside holding her phone tightly in one hand and her bag in the other, her eyes scanning the room the way she always did, carefully, cautiously, memorizing faces, lips, gestures, searching for clues that would help her survive yet another simple task that never felt simple to her. Ordering coffee, something so ordinary for others and yet so exhausting for a deaf woman who had learned the hard way that kindness was never guaranteed, because too many times smiles turned into impatience, and patience into annoyance, and annoyance into embarrassment that burned deeper than words ever could. And as she walked toward the counter she already felt the familiar tension in her chest, the quiet fear of being misunderstood, of being rushed, of being made to feel small, again, but she reminded herself to breathe. Reminded herself that she deserved to be there just as much as anyone else, even if the world often disagreed, and the cafe was warm, filled with the smell of roasted beans and steamed milk, sunlight pouring through the windows, people laughing, talking, living loudly in a way she could never fully access, though she felt it in vibrations, in movement, in the way the air shifted when someone laughed too hard, and she stood in line rehearsing the order in her head, not the words but the signs, the gestures, the plan. Point at the menu, show the note on her phone, smile apologetically, hope the barista would understand, hope they wouldn't sigh, hope they wouldn't shout as if volume could replace clarity, hope they wouldn't look at her with that look, the one that said, "You're making this difficult," when all she wanted was a cup of coffee and a moment of normalcy. And when it was finally her turn, she stepped forward and lifted her phone, her fingers already trembling slightly, but before she could even show the screen the young barista started talking quickly, her mouth moving fast, eyes barely meeting Emma's, and Emma shook her head gently and signed, "I'm deaf," pointing to her ear and then to the phone, but the barista didn't understand, her smile faltering, confusion crossing her face, and she tried again, louder this time, as if volume could bridge silence, and Emma's cheeks flushed, her heart sinking, the familiar wall rising between her and the rest of the world. And she typed quickly on her phone, "I'd like a latte, please," holding it up, hoping this would be enough, but the barista glanced at it, nodded uncertainly, then turned to ask another coworker something Emma couldn't hear, and people behind her shifted impatiently, arms crossed, eyes rolling, time stretching painfully as Emma stood there feeling exposed, like a problem everyone wished would disappear, and that was when it happened, when a man from the side stepped forward gently, not intruding, not rushing, just present, and Emma noticed him because he didn't speak right away. He raised his hands instead, slowly, carefully, and signed, "Can I help?" And for a moment Emma froze, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing, because it had been so long since anyone outside her small circle had signed to her without being asked, so long since anyone had met her where she was instead of forcing her to adapt. And when it hit her, when understanding bloomed in her chest like sudden warmth after a long winter, her face lit up before she could stop it, a real smile, wide and bright and full of relief, and she signed back quickly, gratefully, explaining her order, her movements flowing with ease now that she was finally understood, and the man nodded. Turning to the barista and speaking calmly, clearly, translating, his voice steady, patient, and the tension in the air dissolved, the impatience behind her fading as the moment shifted, and Emma felt something loosen inside her, something she didn't realize she'd been holding so tight, and as the barista prepared the drink, the man turned back to her and signed again, introducing himself as Daniel, his signs not perfect but sincere, learned, practiced with care, and she introduced herself too, still smiling, still glowing from the simple miracle of being seen, and she noticed then the small boy sitting at a nearby table watching them with curious eyes, crayons scattered everywhere, and Daniel followed her gaze and smiled, signing that he was his son, Noah, that he was a single dad, that he'd learned sign language for his younger sister years ago and never forgotten it, because some things once learned stay in your hands forever, and Emma felt something stir in her chest at that, a quiet admiration, a respect that ran deeper than attraction, because kindness like that was intentional, earned, and when her coffee was ready Daniel handed it to her with a small bow that made her laugh silently, her shoulders shaking, joy radiating through her, and in that moment the cafe didn't feel like a battlefield anymore, it felt like a place of connection, of possibility, of unexpected humanity, and as Emma took her cup and signed "Thank you," Really thank you. Daniel shrugged modestly, signing that everyone deserves to be understood, and those words stayed with her long after she left the cafe, long after the warmth of the cup faded from her hands, because something else had been lit that day, something brighter than a smile, something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, the world was capable of learning her language after all. Emma didn't realize how light her steps felt until she was halfway down the street, the cafe door closing behind her and the city unfolding in front of her in its usual chaos of movement and sound she could not hear but always sensed, the vibrations of life pressing against her skin, and yet something was different now, something softer, warmer, as if the world had tilted just slightly in her favor, and she glanced down at the coffee cup in her hand, still warm, still real, as if to confirm that the moment hadn't been imagined, because moments like that rarely happened to her, moments where she didn't have to fight to exist, where she wasn't reduced to her silence, where someone chose to meet her in her language without pity or impatience, and she smiled to herself, replaying the way Daniel's hands had moved, careful but confident, the way his eyes had stayed on hers, not drifting, not distracted, the way he had waited for her to finish signing instead of interrupting. A small thing to most people, but to her it meant everything. It meant respect, and as she walked she thought about how many times she had left places feeling smaller than when she entered, shoulders tight, heart bruised, carrying the weight of being difficult, in a world that refused to slow down, and today for once she felt taller, lighter, seen, and that feeling lingered long after she reached the park near her apartment, where she often went to sit and think. And she chose a bench beneath a tree whose branches swayed gently, leaves moving in patterns she loved watching, because even silence had rhythm if you paid attention, and she took a sip of her coffee, closing her eyes briefly, letting herself feel gratitude, not just for the drink but for the human connection that had come with it, and she wondered about Daniel, about the lines she'd noticed near his eyes that suggested tiredness but also warmth. About the little boy with crayons who had watched them like the world was something safe and curious, and she wondered what kind of man took the time to learn sign language, and more importantly, what kind of man kept using it long after he no longer had to, because life had taught her that kindness was often temporary, situational, but his hadn't felt that way, it had felt woven into him, and as the day went on Emma tried to focus on her usual routine, answering emails for the design work she did from home, sketching ideas, but her mind kept drifting back, replaying the moment again and again, not obsessively but gently, like touching a bruise that didn't hurt anymore, just to remember it had been there. And hours later, when the light outside shifted and the sky began to soften toward evening, there was a knock at her door, unexpected, sharp enough that she felt it through the floor before she saw it through the peephole, and when she opened the door she was surprised to see her friend Maya standing there, already mid-sentence, her mouth moving quickly until she remembered and switched to signing, asking what was wrong because Emma's smile looked different, brighter, and Emma laughed silently, pulling her inside and telling her everything, every detail, every movement, every expression, because moments like that deserved to be shared, and Maya's eyes widened as she listened, teasing her gently, saying it sounded like the beginning of something out of one of Emma's sketches, something hopeful, and Emma shook her head, dismissing it, saying it was just a kind stranger, just one good moment, but even as she signed the words she didn't fully believe them, because something inside her knew that not all moments passed without leaving a mark. And across the city, in a small apartment cluttered with toys and half-folded laundry, Daniel was helping Noah brush his teeth. Watching his son's reflection in the mirror, smiling at the exaggerated faces he made, and yet his mind wasn't fully there, it was back in the cafe, back at the counter, at the woman with expressive eyes and careful hands, the way her entire face had transformed when she realized he could sign, the way that smile had lit something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time, something hopeful but also terrifying, because being a single father had taught him caution, had taught him to protect his heart the same way he protected his son, fiercely, deliberately, and yet he couldn't ignore the pull of that moment, the sense that he had stepped briefly into someone else's world and had been welcomed, trusted. And after Noah was asleep and the apartment finally quiet, Daniel sat on the couch scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone, until he paused, thinking about how he hadn't even asked for Emma's number, hadn't wanted to push, hadn't wanted to turn kindness into expectation, and yet a small part of him wondered if fate had a way of crossing paths again. And the next morning, when Emma returned to the same cafe. Not because she needed coffee but because she needed confirmation. Because hope was a fragile thing and she needed to know if it was foolish. She felt her heart sink when she didn't see him at first. And she ordered successfully this time using her phone. The barista kinder now, more patient, and Emma told herself it was silly to expect more. That life didn't work like stories, and yet just as she turned to leave, she saw him at a corner table, Noah beside him, coloring intently, and Daniel looked up at that exact moment, as if something had tugged at him, and when their eyes met, recognition sparked instantly, mutual, undeniable, and Daniel stood, smiling, lifting his hands in greeting, signing hello, and Emma's heart skipped in a way that startled her, because this time it wasn't just gratitude lighting her smile, it was anticipation, and she walked over, sitting across from him, and they began to talk, not rushed, not awkward, but slow and deliberate, hands moving, expressions soft, Noah occasionally chiming in with drawings and questions, and Emma realized that conversation didn't need sound to be full, that silence could hold laughter, warmth, curiosity, and as the minutes stretched into an hour, something gentle but powerful settled between them, the understanding that this was not just coincidence anymore, that two lives had brushed against each other and neither wanted to pull away, and for the first time in a long time, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be understood not just in moments, but in life, and that thought both terrified and thrilled her, because hope, once awakened, was impossible to silence. Emma didn't expect the feeling that followed her home that evening, the quiet heaviness mixed with a strange lightness, as if something important had begun without asking her permission, and she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move as cars passed outside, thinking about how natural it had felt to sit across from Daniel, how conversation had flowed without sound yet with depth, how Noah's small hands had tugged at her sleeve to show her a drawing of a crooked house with a sun that took up half the page, and how Daniel had watched those moments with a tenderness that told her more about him than words ever could, and she wondered when she had last allowed herself to imagine anything beyond survival, because for so long her life had been about adapting, about preparing for misunderstanding, about lowering expectations so disappointment wouldn't hurt as much, and yet now, without warning, her mind kept drifting toward possibility, and that scared her more than loneliness ever had, because hope demanded courage, and the next few days passed with an unusual sense of anticipation woven through her routine, her work deadlines still there, her quiet apartment still familiar, but everything felt slightly charged, as if the air itself was waiting, and when she returned to the cafe again, not intentionally searching but not avoiding either, she found Daniel there once more, this time alone, laptop open, coffee cooling beside him, and when he saw her he smiled with recognition that felt less like surprise and more like relief, and he signed that he'd hoped she might come back, that he hadn't wanted to intrude or assume, but that seeing her again felt like a gift, and Emma felt her chest tighten at the honesty of that, because it mirrored her own thoughts too closely, and they talked longer this time, about small things and bigger ones, about how Emma had lost her hearing as a child after an illness and how the world had changed shape overnight, about how Daniel had become a single father sooner than he'd ever planned and how life had narrowed and deepened at the same time, about the quiet griefs people carried without advertising them, and there was no rush to fill pauses, because silence between them felt comfortable, not empty, and when Daniel asked, carefully, respectfully, if she'd like to walk with him and Noah sometime, just the park, nothing complicated, Emma hesitated only for a moment before agreeing, surprised by her own bravery, and the following weekend they met beneath open sky, Noah running ahead, laughter visible in his whole body even if Emma couldn't hear it, and Daniel stayed close to her pace, matching his steps to hers without comment, and Emma realized then that care often showed itself in small adjustments, not grand gestures, and as days turned into weeks, their connection deepened quietly, naturally, coffee turning into walks, walks into shared meals into something that felt like belonging, and Emma found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't known. She'd been tense, her shoulders lowering, her smiles coming easier, and yet beneath the warmth there was fear too, the fear of what would happen when real life intruded, when misunderstandings grew larger than coffee orders, when patience was tested, because she knew from experience that not everyone who began with kindness stayed, and Daniel carried his own fears, watching himself grow attached, watching Noah grow fond of Emma, cautious of allowing something precious to form that might later break, And one evening, sitting together after Noah had fallen asleep on the couch between them, Daniel finally signed what had been weighing on him. That he was afraid of hurting her unintentionally, afraid of failing at communication. Afraid of not being enough, and Emma felt tears rise as she answered, telling him that she was tired of being protected from pain by distance, that she wanted to be chosen fully or not at all, that life had already taught her loss and she refused to let fear write her future. And something shifted in that moment, something solidified, not into promises or labels but into commitment, the quiet kind that grows roots before it shows leaves. And as Daniel reached for her hand, hesitantly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, Emma let her fingers intertwine with his, feeling the warmth, the reality of connection, and she knew then that whatever lay ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest, and that was enough, because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't asking the world to understand her alone. She wasn't standing at a counter hoping for patience, she was building something with someone willing to learn her language not just with his hands, but with his heart.